The North Korean foreign minister, who described Donald Trump as a barking dog. We're expecting to hear more from him tomorrow. Any idea what he's likely to say then?
Well, perhaps he'll pick up on the Rocket Man riff and somehow combine that with the barking dog metaphor. Who knows? It's unclear, but probably North Korea will also carry on sounding extremely bellicose. But the interesting thing about the US sanctions that were announced today is that this, of course, is a diplomatic move. So despite that language we heard from Donald Trump about threatening to destroy North Korea, mocking Kim Jong-un, the US is escalating peaceful means of trying to isolate North Korea and stop it working on its nuclear program. And in fact, the US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, just said, you know, no one wants war. We don't want war. That's the last thing that anyone wants, although you could be mistaken from listening to Donald Trump that perhaps he was entertaining the possibility. But so it's a twin-track approach, isn't it, that the US is pursuing at the moment, and we'll see how North Korea responds when we hear from the foreign minister, as you say.
Indeed we will. Laura Trevelyan, thanks very much for joining me. Well, with me now is Bruce Klingner, who's formerly served as CIA Deputy Division Chief for Korea and is now at the Heritage Foundation. Bruce, thanks very much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
We're hearing from Laura that these are very tough, but why might they work when 9 other rounds of sanctions haven't?
Well, I think these measures are potentially significant, significant in that they seem to move away from previous laws and executive orders that were focused on targets that were committing some kind of wrongdoing, illicit activities, money laundering, etc. These are going after simply trading with North Korea, even legal, illicit trade. And in that sense, as Laura said, it's going towards more Iran-like sanctions. So, but the questions would be, will China actually cut off the banking trade with North Korea? We've heard many promises from them over the years, and they've only timidly implemented required UN resolution sanctions. Also, will the U.S. Treasury more fully enforce these measures, which are going after even legitimate trade, more strongly than they did against illegal activity, which they only sort of timidly, incrementally enforced?
But nevertheless, despite all the rhetoric and fire and fury, this sounds remarkably like business as usual, a conventional way of dealing with North Korea.
Well, in the sense that by focusing on pressure and targeted financial measures and sanctions, in a way it's lengthening the fuse of war, in that if we're focusing on pressure and that we, as we convince people that there is much more we can do on sanctions, we have been pulling our punches contrary to misperceptions, that we should be pursuing these kind of measures before we go to something like a preventative military attack, which the administration seemed to be leaning more towards earlier this year.
You just mentioned China and the central bank. If they do follow through, is this a sign that China is now prepared to do more? And if so, why?
Well, it could either be that they are willing to do more, or they're willing to do enough to derail what was becoming a growing momentum on a freight train coming down the track of the U.S. imposing secondary sanctions against Chinese banks, perhaps along the lines of the significant fines we put on European banks, $12 billion in fines on European banks for money laundering for Iran. So far, not a penny in sanctions on Chinese banks. I think that was gaining momentum. We've sanctioned one Chinese bank identified as money laundering concern, and I think more were in work. So maybe China was doing enough to prevent what could have been more stronger punitive measures against Chinese banks.
Is China coming to the point where the scales are starting to tip in favor of doing something about North Korea rather than being frightened of North Korea collapsing?
I think we're still unsure. We felt we've been at the crossroads before. China has talked tough, has periodically strongly implemented measures before backing off. But even when North Korea does a clear provocation, even a military attack against the South, China has often disregarded the evidence or simply called on both Koreas to show restraint when it's only their Korea which is acting up.
Well, Bruce Klingner, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Look at some of the day's other news now, and the Chief Executive